Before Charles Darwin changed the way we understand life on Earth, he was just a quiet, uncertain young man who almost stayed home. He wasn't the smartest student. He wasn't the boldest speaker. He was seasick, doubtful, sensitive. And yet, the questions forming in his mind would one day shake the foundations of science, religion, and humanity itself. This is not just the story of evolution. It is the story of how one careful observer, Charles Darwin, slowly realized that life is not fixed, not frozen, but constantly changing. And once you see what he saw, you can never look at the world the same way again. In the quiet market town of Shrewsbury, in the west of England, on a cold February day in 1809, a child was born into comfort, curiosity, and quiet expectation. His name was Charles Darwin. The house where he grew up, known as the Mount, stood above the River Severn, surrounded by gardens and gentle countryside. It was a place of stability and routine. His father, Robert Darwin, was a large, imposing man with a serious temperament and a successful medical practice. He believed in practicality, in reputation, and steady careers. His mother, Susanna Wedgwood Darwin, came from a distinguished Wedgwood family, known for their fine pottery and progressive ideas. The home was intellectually alive, but emotionally reserved, shaped by the customs of early 19th century England. As a small boy, Charles was not considered extraordinary in the classroom. He struggled with rote memorization and showed little passion for classical languages, which formed the backbone of formal education at the time. Teachers sometimes dismissed him as average, but outside the classroom, something far more important was developing. He noticed things. He noticed how insects differed subtly in shape and color. He noticed how plants grew differently in shade and sun. He noticed small changes in rocks, feathers, and shells. He was drawn to detail, to variation, to quiet differences that many would overlook. His pockets were often filled with beetles, stones, bits of bone, and plant specimens. Collection was not merely a hobby for him. It was a way of understanding the world. When Charles was only 8 years old, his mother died. The loss was profound, though in later years he struggled to remember her clearly. Her absence left a quiet space in his childhood, one filled partly by his older sisters, who helped raise him. Grief was not openly discussed in his household. Life continued with discipline and expectation. As he grew older, his father began thinking about Charles's future. Medicine seemed a natural path. The Darwin family valued professional respectability, and Robert Darwin expected his son to follow a practical and honorable career. At 16, Charles was sent to the University of Edinburgh to study medicine. The city was intellectually vibrant, full of Enlightenment ideas and scientific debate. Yet the reality of medical training in the early 19th century was harsh. Surgeries were performed without anesthesia. The sounds of pain echoed through lecture halls. Blood and suffering were unavoidable. Charles could not bear it. He found himself turning away from surgical demonstrations, unsettled and distressed. His interest drifted from medicine to natural history. Instead of focusing on anatomy lectures, he began spending time along the rocky shores near Edinburgh, studying marine life. He learned how to observe carefully, how to dissect small sea creatures, how to record findings with patience. He joined student societies where scientific ideas were discussed more freely than in formal classrooms. He listened to debates about geology, about life's origins, about the age of the Earth. Though he did not yet form bold conclusions, these conversations widened his thinking. Eventually, it became clear that medicine would not be his path. His father, disappointed but determined, proposed another respectable profession, the clergy. A country clergyman's life offered stability, income, and social standing. It also allowed time for natural studies as a gentleman scholar. For many educated men of the time, faith and natural inquiry coexisted without tension. And so Charles enrolled at Christ's College, Cambridge, to prepare for ordination in the Church of England. At Cambridge, his academic performance remained unremarkable in traditional subjects. But outside formal lectures, his true education flourished. He met Professor John Stevens Henslow, a botanist who became mentor, guide, and friend. Henslow recognized something valuable in Darwin's restless curiosity. He encouraged systematic study rather than casual collecting. He taught him how to observe patterns, how to record data properly, how to ask careful questions. Under Henslow's influence, Darwin's love of beetle collecting intensified into near obsession. He once famously described holding one beetle in each hand and placing a third in his mouth to keep from losing it. The detail may seem amusing, but it reveals something deeper, an intense fascination with variation. Each beetle species differed slightly from the next. Subtle differences mattered. Meanwhile, he also studied geology under Adam Sedgwick, who introduced him to the concept of deep time. Rock layers were not random. They told stories of ancient environments, of slow transformation, of immense spans of years. The Earth, Darwin began to understand, was far older than many traditional interpretations suggested. This idea settled quietly in his mind. By the time he graduated from Cambridge in 1831, Charles Darwin was 22 years old. He was not yet a revolutionary thinker. He had not formulated any grand theory. He was simply observant, patient, and increasingly aware that nature was more dynamic and complex than it first appeared. He planned to become a clergyman. His life seemed destined for rural parishes and gentle scholarship. But something unexpected was about to interrupt that path. A surveying ship of the Royal Navy, HMS Beagle, was preparing for a long voyage to chart the coast of South America. The captain required a gentleman companion with scientific interests. Through Henslow's recommendation, Darwin's name was suggested. At first, his father refused permission. The journey was dangerous. It would last years. It offered no guaranteed career advantage. But after discussion and persuasion from relatives, especially his uncle Josiah Wedgwood, permission was granted. Darwin agreed to go. He stood at the edge of the sea in late 1831, not yet knowing that this voyage would stretch across nearly 5 years. Not yet knowing that distant islands and unfamiliar species would challenge everything he thought he understood. The young man who boarded the Beagle believed he was embarking on an adventure of observation. He did not yet realize he was beginning a journey that would eventually reshape humanity's understanding of life itself. On December 27, 1831, the HMS Beagle finally left the shores of England, cutting slowly through the cold Atlantic waters. The young naturalist on board, Charles Darwin, was 22 years old, uncertain of his future, prone to seasickness, and carrying more curiosity than confidence. The early weeks at sea were difficult. Darwin suffered terribly from motion sickness. The constant rocking of the ship left him weak and nauseated. Many days he lay in his narrow cabin, unable to read or write, wondering whether he had made a terrible mistake. The ocean seemed endless. England grew distant. Everything familiar faded into memory. But whenever the Beagle anchored near land, his discomfort vanished. South America unfolded before him in vast, dramatic landscapes. Dense Brazilian forests hummed with insects and echoed with unfamiliar birds. The air felt heavy and alive. For Darwin, walking through tropical jungle was like stepping into another world. The diversity of life overwhelmed him. Plants twisted upward in elaborate forms. Brilliantly colored beetles crawled across bark. Monkeys shrieked high in the canopy. He collected constantly. Specimens were packed carefully into crates. Insects pinned and labeled. Plants pressed flat, bones wrapped for transport. He filled notebook after notebook with observations. He described colors, textures, habits, environments. He was not yet theorizing boldly. He was observing patiently. In Argentina, something caught his attention that would linger in his mind for years. While riding across the wide plains, known as the Pampas, he discovered enormous fossilized bones embedded in the earth. With help, he unearthed the remains of gigantic, extinct mammals. Creatures resembling giant sloths and armored beasts far larger than any living species. What struck him was not only their size, but their resemblance to animals still living nearby. Why would extinct giants resemble smaller modern creatures of the same region? Why would species appear related across time? The thought did not yet form into a theory. It simply rested quietly in his notebooks. The voyage continued southward. The Beagle navigated treacherous waters around the southern tip of South America. In Tierra del Fuego, Darwin encountered indigenous communities living in conditions that shocked many Europeans of the time. He recorded his observations carefully, though his reflections were shaped by the cultural assumptions of his era. Still, the experience broadened his understanding of human variation and adaptation to environment. Then there were earthquakes. In Chile, Darwin experienced a powerful tremor that shook the ground beneath him. Buildings crumbled. The earth itself seemed unstable. Later, he observed raised sections of coastline, areas where the land had lifted after seismic activity. Seashells were found high above current sea level. The planet, he realized, was not static. Geological forces slowly reshaped continents. Mountains rose, shores shifted, landscapes transformed over immense spans of time. The Earth was active, dynamic, ancient. This understanding of gradual geological change would become essential to his later thinking. If the planet could change slowly over time, could life do the same? In 1835, the Beagle reached a remote cluster of volcanic islands in the Pacific Ocean, the Galápagos Islands. The islands appeared harsh and dry at first glance, scattered across dark lava fields beneath an intense sun. Yet life existed there, strange, resilient life. Darwin noticed something subtle but deeply important. The giant tortoises differed slightly from island to island. Mockingbirds showed variations in beak shape and plumage, depending on which island they inhabited. Finches, though similar overall, possessed different beak sizes and forms, seemingly adapted to different food sources. At first, Darwin did not fully grasp the significance of these variations. He collected specimens without precise labeling of their island origins, something he would later regret. But gradually, a question began to grow. Why would closely related species vary slightly from island to island? If species were independently created and fixed forever, why would they show such regional patterns? Why would island species resemble those from nearby South America more than those from distant continents? The idea stirred quietly. Perhaps species were not fixed. Perhaps they changed. The Beagle continued its journey across the Pacific, stopping in Tahiti, New Zealand, and Australia. Darwin observed marsupials in Australia, mammals with pouches unlike most others in the world. Again, geographic isolation seemed linked to unique forms of life. Patterns. Always patterns. By the time the Beagle turned homeward in 1836, nearly 5 years had passed. Darwin was no longer the uncertain young man who had boarded in England. His notebooks were filled. His collections were vast. His mind was alive with questions. He did not yet possess a complete theory. He had no clear explanation for the variations he had observed. But seeds had been planted, fossils resembling living species, island creatures varying subtly from place to place, geological evidence of slow, powerful change over immense time. As the ship approached England's shores once more, Darwin carried with him not only specimens and journals, but a growing suspicion that life itself might be shaped by gradual transformation. He could not yet say how, but the question had begun, and it would not leave him. Back in England, the real work, the thinking, the doubting, the re-examining of everything he believed was about to begin. When Charles Darwin returned to England in October of 1836, he was only 27 years old. Yet he carried the weight of 5 years of observation, thousands of specimens, and a mind quietly unsettled. London was loud compared to the open seas and distant coasts he had grown used to. But he did not return as an unknown young man. Word of his work aboard the HMS Beagle had already reached respected scientists. His mentor, John Stevens Henslow, had shared Darwin's letters during the voyage, and the scientific community was curious. Darwin immediately began organizing the massive collections he had gathered. Crates were opened. Fossils were examined by specialists. Birds from the Galápagos Islands were studied carefully. And here, something remarkable happened. The birds he had assumed were different kinds of wrens grosbeaks, and finches turned out to be closely related species, now famously known as Galápagos finches. Their beaks differed in shape and size depending on diet and island environment. Some were thick and powerful for cracking seeds. Others were slender for feeding on insects. They were not random variations. They were patterned. Darwin began to think more deeply. He settled in London for a time, entering scientific circles and attending gatherings of naturalists and geologists. He read constantly. One book in particular had a profound influence on him. Principles of Geology by Charles Lyell. Lyell argued that Earth's features were shaped by slow, continuous processes over vast stretches of time, not sudden catastrophic events alone. If the Earth changed gradually, Darwin wondered, might life also change gradually? He began filling private notebooks with speculation. These were not meant for publication. They were exploratory, raw, and cautious. In 1837, he sketched his first rough evolutionary tree, a branching diagram with the simple words written above it, I think. The idea forming in his mind was both simple and radical. Perhaps species were not fixed creations. Perhaps they descended from common ancestors, branching over time. But how would such change occur? Darwin continued observing breeders of pigeons and livestock. He noticed that humans could select certain traits, larger size, specific colors, desirable behaviors, and amplify them over generations through selective breeding. This artificial selection demonstrated that variation already existed within species. Nature, he began to suspect, might be doing something similar, but without intention. In 1838, another piece of the puzzle fell into place when Darwin read an essay on the principle of population by Thomas Malthus. Malthus argued that populations grow faster than resources allow, leading to competition for survival. Darwin suddenly saw the mechanism. If more individuals are born than can survive, and if individuals vary slightly from one another, then those with traits better suited to their environment would be more likely to survive and reproduce. Over time, those advantageous traits will become more common. He later called this process natural selection. The realization was not triumphant. It was sobering. Natural selection implied struggle. It implied death as a constant force shaping life. It suggested that species were not permanent, but temporary forms in a long chain of transformation. And it challenged deeply rooted beliefs about divine design and fixed creation. Darwin did not rush to publish. Instead, he withdrew from public life gradually, moving to the quiet village of Down in Kent. There, in a modest house surrounded by gardens and countryside, he would spend the rest of his life thinking, experimenting, and writing. He married his cousin, Emma Wedgwood, in 1839. Emma was intelligent, thoughtful, and deeply religious. Their marriage was affectionate and strong, but Darwin's emerging ideas caused him quiet internal conflict. He knew that his theory, if fully expressed, would trouble traditional interpretations of creation. In Down House, Darwin established routines. He walked the same gravel path daily, a path he called the sand walk, circling slowly as he thought through problems. He conducted small experiments in his garden. He studied barnacles for 8 painstaking years, classifying and dissecting them to understand variation within species in microscopic detail. His health, however, was fragile. He suffered from chronic illness, nausea, fatigue, heart palpitations. Some historians speculate about the causes, but whatever the origin, it forced him into a life of controlled routine and limited travel. Quietly, steadily, he gathered evidence. He corresponded with scientists around the world. He studied orchids and their intricate methods of pollination. He examined how seeds could survive in salt water, suggesting ways plants might spread across oceans. He investigated earthworms and their slow transformation of soil. Everything pointed toward gradual change shaped by natural forces. Yet he hesitated. For more than 20 years, Darwin refined his argument in private. He feared controversy. He feared hurting Emma's faith. He feared public backlash. The implications of his theory were enormous, not only scientifically, but socially and religiously. Then, in 1858, A letter arrived from a young naturalist named Alfred Russel Wallace. Wallace had been working in Southeast Asia and independently conceived a theory strikingly similar to Darwin's idea of natural selection. Darwin was stunned. After decades of private work, someone else had reached the same conclusion. Encouraged by colleagues, Darwin and Wallace's ideas were presented jointly to the Linnean Society of London. The presentation caused little immediate reaction, but Darwin knew he could no longer remain silent. He began writing a condensed version of his long-developing theory. It would be titled On the Origin of Species. The quiet naturalist who once collected beetles for pleasure was about to publish a book that would reshape biology forever. And once released, the world would never see life in quite the same way again. In November of 1859, after more than 20 years of quiet thinking, private doubt, careful experimentation, and endless revision, Charles Darwin finally published his book. Its full title was long and deliberate, On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. It did not shout, it did not accuse. It simply laid out evidence, patiently, methodically, page after page. The first printing sold out on the very first day. Darwin had expected resistance. He had braced himself for criticism, but even he could not fully anticipate the scale of the reaction. Some readers were fascinated. Others were unsettled. Many were deeply disturbed. The idea that species were not fixed, that humans and animals shared common ancestry, that life evolved through struggle and selection rather than separate acts of creation, was profoundly challenging to traditional belief systems. Darwin himself did not engage aggressively in public debate. His health remained fragile, and he stayed mostly a down house, letting supporters and critics argue in newspapers, lecture halls, and churches. One of the most famous debates occurred in 1860 at Oxford, where Bishop Samuel Wilberforce clashed publicly with Darwin's ally Thomas Henry Huxley. Though Darwin was not present, the discussion symbolized the cultural shockwaves his theory had unleashed. Yet Darwin's work was not reckless. He had anticipated objections. Entire chapters of On the Origin of Species addressed potential weaknesses in his argument. Gaps in the fossil record, complexity of organs like the eye, instinct, and hybridization. He did not claim to have all answers. He acknowledged uncertainty, but he trusted the weight of accumulated evidence. In the years that followed, Darwin continued refining his ideas. In 1868, he published The Variation of Animals and Plants Under Domestication, expanding on artificial selection. Then, in 1871, he released The Descent of Man, where he applied evolutionary theory directly to human beings. It was here that he stated clearly that humans and apes share a common ancestor, an idea that provoked even deeper controversy. But Darwin approached the subject cautiously. He wrote not to provoke, but to reason. He also explored emotional expression in humans and animals, suggesting continuity between species not only in physical traits, but in behavior and feeling. He studied climbing plants, insectivorous plants, and even earthworms, always returning to careful observation. At Down House, his life followed steady rhythms. Mornings were devoted to writing. Midday walks along the sandwalk path helped him think. Afternoons included correspondence. Evenings were spent quietly with Emma and their children. Despite global debate, his domestic life remained gentle and structured. His marriage endured with tenderness. Though Emma's religious beliefs differed from Charles's increasingly agnostic views, they respected one another deeply. Darwin never described himself as an atheist. He moved gradually from conventional faith toward a more uncertain position, shaped by scientific reflection and personal loss, including the death of his beloved daughter Annie, a grief that affected him profoundly. By the 1870s, Darwin's ideas were gaining wider acceptance within scientific circles. Evolution by natural selection was debated, modified, challenged, and refined, but it could no longer be ignored. Biology itself was being reshaped. Darwin lived long enough to witness this shift. On April 19, 1882, Charles Darwin died at the age of 73. He passed away quietly at home, surrounded by family. The man who once hesitated to publish his ideas was now recognized as one of the most influential thinkers of his century. In a gesture of national respect, he was buried in Westminster Abbey, near Sir Isaac Newton, a symbolic placement among Britain's greatest scientific minds. Over time, new discoveries in genetics would strengthen and clarify Darwin's theory. Scientists like Gregor Mendel, whose work on heredity was not widely known during Darwin's lifetime, would later provide mechanisms explaining how traits pass from generation to generation. The modern synthesis of evolution would unite genetics and natural selection into a powerful framework that continues to guide biology today. But Darwin's greatest contribution was not a single book. It was a way of seeing. He taught the world that life is connected, that species are not isolated creations, but branches on a vast, ancient tree, that small variations, given enough time, can shape extraordinary diversity, that struggle and adaptation are woven into the fabric of existence. He replaced fixed certainty with dynamic continuity, and yet, at heart, he remained what he had always been, a careful observer, a patient note-taker, a man who noticed beetles and hedges and fossils and cliffs and subtle differences in bird beaks. The revolution he sparked did not begin with bold declarations. It began with curiosity. As night falls over the English countryside where he once walked his thinking path, the world continues to evolve quietly. Species adapt, landscapes shift, life persists in endless variation. And in that ongoing, gentle transformation, the legacy of Charles Darwin remains, not as a shout, but as a steady understanding that we are part of a long, unfolding story of life on Earth.